Okay, right. So we're delighted to welcome Simon Assaf to our meeting this evening. And Simon is a climate activist and revolutionary socialist, and he's the commissioning editor of the Public Source. And he's written on the effects of colonialism and capitalism on land, people, and politics across the Middle East, and most particularly in Lebanon. And those effects are, for most people, profoundly negative, and most recently, and obviously in the case of Palestine, catastrophic. But Simon's commitment to materialist class-based analysis reminds us that the situation is never without hope. So, in a recent article of his, he wrote, and I quote, "Yet the solution is at hand. All wealth in society is created by labour power, whether a worker is harvesting fruit, building a house, or assembling a computer. If this wealth is created by labour power, then we can use this power." So it's a challenge to find hope in what has happened in Syria recently, and there are other challenges too. Say, compared with Palestine, where the Israeli genocide is on full display, the situation in Syria is less immediately clear. And Syria asks us to confront difficult questions of geopolitical alignments, the relationship between domestic and global class interests, and indeed the question of what is to be done for local activism in that context. And so we asked Simon to speak about Syria in the form of three what now questions. So, what now for Syria? What now for anti imperialist struggle and indeed the Palestinian struggle in the region? And what now for revolutionary socialism at home? And so hopefully it'll be an insightful and an insightful discussion. And so Simon, if you're okay to sort of take it away, and that would be good, I think, at this point.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be in Ireland, even though not physically in Ireland. It's always a pleasure to speak with the comrades there. I want to start very quickly by saying I did not expect to be in this position that we found ourselves in a month ago. It's an extraordinary shift and points to an analysis I think we have as revolutionary socialists about the nature of struggle and the nature of change, and what I think best describe as the 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 kind of the radical element of change and the way in which change happens from below and the difficulties and complexities of it. So I'll try and address that as best I can. Um, but just to start by saying I was born the year that the Ba'ath Party took power in Syria, 1963. It's all I've known all my life. For us in Lebanon, Syria was always the dark shadow on our shoulder. I, looking back at Syrian history and talking to my father and the older generations, Syria was always the very foundation of kind of Arab Enlightenment before 1970, before the this particular element of the Ba'ath Party took control. It was just full of life, full of theatre, full of art, full of politics, full of revolutionary parties, political parties, all sorts. And ever since I was kind of became politically conscious, which was a very young age, Syria has been this absolute dark room, really. So I'll start with that. And what I wasn't expecting, amidst everything, was that our comrades in Syria, who I can now out. They outed themselves a few weeks ago. We had our first public meeting in Damascus a couple of days ago, addressed by Anna Alexander from here, but also from our comrades in Syria itself. Our organization, which is affiliated to us, the Revolutionary Left Current, had managed to survive under the counter-revolution under the Assad regime and has been able to now appear in a real way in some key cities. Sweda in the south, which is seen as very much the heartland of the revolution. Damascus, of course, but also and Hamma, quite an important strategic city, Homs and Aleppo, and Latakia on the coast. So it was great. We had a joint meeting with them the other day where we discussed out and were able to finally meet the shadows, if you like, and it was really good. And the first thing I want to say is how extraordinarily sharp they are, how extraordinarily political they are, and how really I think for revolutionary socialists have uh, our feet on the ground inside of Syria and have survived, I think, beyond expectations. So just want to start with that. Our comrades there are great. It's really good, and it's fantastic to finally meet them. The same with our comrades now, we can talk about this. Our comrades in Lebanon who had been sheltering and hiding Syrian revolutionaries, extremely stressful conditions for the past 6 or 7 years. And the day after the fall of the regime, we lost them all. They all went home. So the Lebanese comrades are now complaining about the fact that some of the best revolutionaries have gone back to Syria. So in this context, I want to say there's this kind of incredible relief, I think, for us, and that we had been working quite hard for quite a few years now to try and maintain some form of revolutionary organization under extremely difficult conditions. So I just want to start with that. So that's the good news. And now that we can out everyone in Syria, which is great, to say how much they appreciate the support and help that revolutionaries across the world were able to give them, and how close they were watching political discussions and so on, and shaping their own analysis of of the struggle inside of Syria. So that's out the way. There's several ways we can approach this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk very briefly about the geopolitical situation, and hopefully then this won't be the big element of the discussion. Quite a lot of the chatter at the moment is seeing Syria as a pawn in this great chess game that's taking place, and there's a million theories and attempting to understand the subtleties of the changes and the axis of resistance and Turkey and Qatar and so on. So that there is going to be a little bit about that, just put that a little bit of perspective, but to kind of pull back away from that and look at the dynamic of the revolution inside of Syria itself, its limitations. Originally, the counter-revolution, why the Assad regime was then unable to survive. And then I want to hopefully bring some of the information about the nature of the fall on December the 8th, and why it's important to understand that and the dynamic that's now emerging inside of the country. So just to start with, I think when we look at the geopolitical picture of the Middle East, we have to look at it in kind of the very widest context for starters. So we have to talk about the Middle East always has been for for over a century and a half, a battleground for rival imperialist designs. So at one point it was mainly the British and the French. At some point the Italians got involved. Even at one point Austria was involved. The Russians, of course, under the old Tsar, was very interested, and of course Germany, who were desperately trying to join the imperial gang, attempting to build a railway that went from Berlin down to Baghdad, and in so doing really sort of triggered the First World War. The way in which imperialism kind of came into the region in terms of the export of capital, and then how after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we saw its dismemberment, and how the old social relations in the region collapsed or were broken, I should put it. And then we have, if you like, that stage in which Britain and France dominate, the foundation of the State of Israel, the need for control of the Suez Canal. All these things are help shape, I think, the beginnings of this kind of geopolitical struggle over various countries and various states of the region. But if you were to look at it today, I think it's very important we start with this: that the US attempted in 2003 to impose itself dramatically inside of the Arab world with the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was supposed to show the dominance of US power. It was supposed to express this desire for the project for the new American century. And instead, what happened was the resistance side of Iraq, the fracturing of the state, the various uprisings that took place actually broke this occupation and delivered, instead of a great victory for the US over the next century, a tremendous defeat. And this defeat meant that the Americans began to retreat, if you like. It lost its influence, began to retreat away from from Iraq, and in so doing, then opened up two other groups of forces. The first is the kind of regional imperial powers. So we can group them, with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has Qatar and Saudi Arabia, you have the Arab Emirates and so on. This kind of massive block of capital, the wealthiest part of the Arab world. Then we have Turkey, which has its own kind of sub-imperial designs. Specifically, one of the big winners of the American occupation of Iraq was able to export massive amount of capital into northern Iraq, the oil and so on, and become quite crucial for the development of the Turkish boom. So you export capital, and in so doing, then you're able to reap its rewards, if you like. Then there's the big one, which is the arrival of China, and this is really crucial to understand now the U.S. strategy and why and what's at play inside of Syria. I will say, March of last year, before October 7th, there was a very important meeting that took place without the Americans' knowledge, organized by China, in which they ordered the foreign minister of Iran and of Saudi Arabia to Beijing without the Americans' knowledge, and basically read them the riot act. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia are China's biggest exporters of oil. China has now become one of the biggest exporters of capital inside the Arab world, also inside of Africa. And in so doing, the great imperial powers, the US and its Western allies against China, is playing out not militarily inside of the Arab world, but in terms of just sheer scale of investment. And China's winning this. All the new developments, industrial developments taking place along the Suez Canal is Chinese capital. Chinese capital, Chinese capital, Chinese capital is the dominant one. The same with what's happening in the Horn of Africa with Djibouti and so on. Chinese capital is pouring into these regions, and therefore, at the same time as US capital is being pushed out, if you like. On top of that, of course, there's the Gulf states and the role they play, but also the way in which the retreat of US power actually means now that there's much more of a struggle. I was always reminded, I remember very well 1982 war when the Israelis invaded Lebanon. And Ronald Reagan got on the phone to Menachem Begin, basically said, you're doing a Holocaust. You need to stop what you're doing. Margaret Thatcher, who's by no means a left-winger, imposed a 12-year arms embargo on Israel because the Israelis wouldn't do what she asked. And Israel was very much seen as subordinate to imperial powers. To today, when you have the US under Biden putting red line after red line toward, in front of the Israelis and then just smashing through it. Basically, the Israelis now beginning to break free, if you like, of the more of some of the constraints put forward by imperialism. I'm not going to overplay this because obviously this relationship is still very important. But to understand it now, there's much more room for maneuver, much more room for wilder ambitions, if you like, inside of the area. So we have this big struggle taking place. There are regional struggles taking place, and inside of that, obviously, there are. We could leave it there, and a lot of people do, and I think that's a mistake because then we have to talk about that other force, the wild radical force of popular uprisings and what people do. So, in that context, then I want to move on to understanding Syria, the nature of the Syrian revolution that emerged in 2011, 2012. Why, in a sense, it was different to the other revolutions, and how this difference actually meant that for Syrian uprising, it had to go much, much further in order just to reach the first stage than either the Tunisian uprising or the Egyptian, the Tahrir, the Tahrir revolution of Egypt. First of all, there was no room pre-2011 for any kind of dissent to take place inside of Syria at all. So when we used to go to Egypt to the Cairo conferences under the old regime of Hosni Mubarak, we were able to meet the Muslim Brotherhood, we were able to meet the Nasserite Arab nationalists, we were able to hold joint meetings with them and the revolutionary socialists to discuss strategy. People knew a revolution was coming. We were able to do this, if you like, under the nose of the regime. At the same time, there was this mass movement of Egyptian workers beginning to develop, strikes that began in places like Mahal al-Kubra, and then in Alexandria and so on, that gave, if you like, that revolutionary movement a massive popular base but also the economic power that comes with working class organization. And the same thing happened in Tunisia with the intervention of the trade unions and so on. Legal trade unions intervened in the first uprising to push out the old regime. There was nothing like this in Syria. In Syria, there was no independent movement. There was no independent or any form of organization, any form of space for there to be any kind of discussion. So when the Syrian revolution explodes extremely quickly. It has very little industrial weight behind it. There's very little organized working class struggle that takes place. It begins to develop a little bit inside of the revolution that ostensibly at the beginning it just starts with street protests. And the immediate question for the Syrian uprising in 2011, 2012 was the need not simply to remove the top, if you like, the top layer, the Mubaraks and so on, the Ben Alis and so on, but actually to completely dismantle the state as it existed. And this movement spreads extraordinarily fast. It begins to self-organize in a very limited way. It begins to self-organize in something called the coordinating committees. The coordinating committees were neighborhood-based organizations, sometimes city-based organizations, but they weren't working class organizations like the independent trade unions in Egypt or inside of Tunisia. So the revolutionary upsurge had this massive popular base amongst working class people. There's huge numbers of working class people inside of Syria, but it didn't formulate itself in the same way as it did the others. So the revolution reaches a point, and I remember our first kind of contacts with revolutionaries there. Just the mere ability to have a political discussion was difficult because politics inside of these coordinating committees was banned. Politics was seen as a bad word. They were simply seen as a mechanism to organize street cleaning, take over some of the functions of the state, and so on. So it begins from a very weak position and has to take on the full force of the state extremely quickly and from a much weaker position. During 2011, 2012, there were mutinies that took place inside the Syrian army. We know about these. There were mass executions that took place. There was all kinds of things that we now understand and beginning to emerge, the details of these beginning to emerge, that was never able to reach that point, the tipping point that they reached in the other revolutions. The other kind of element of this, which made it much more complicated, was that both Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, and to a certain extent Lebanon, all the places where they had the kind of Arab Spring movement, these were essentially pro-Western regimes. It was a relatively straightforward question for many of the Arab revolutionaries. If you're an Arab nationalist, or if you're Islamist, or if you're on the left, or if you're on, just coming into struggle, was relatively straightforward. These are the Western-backed regimes, and we overthrow them. So that was it. So, but what you have in Syria is a slightly different dynamic in that this is a regime that is under threat of imperialism. It was a regime that was part of what was known as the axis of resistance, allied itself with Iran, allied itself with the resistance in the south, with Hezbollah and so on. And in so doing, then it becomes a much more complicated question of how far what we call in a permanent revolution, whether these regimes, whether the movements in these regimes had the right to make a revolution, and this split massively the nationalists away from the struggle, became dominated very much more than by the Islamists and very very small segments of the left. So that was an element of it. And so when the regime looked like it was about to collapse, the Hezbollah sends its troops into Syria, something it should never have done, and which there was mass resentment inside of Lebanon about. We don't interfere in other people's countries. Hezbollah is about the resistance to the Israelis in the south. It's not a tool for Arab regimes to suppress their people. This was a huge argument that takes place, especially amongst its supporters inside of Hezbollah, and turned out, fun enough, in the end, to be an absolute disastrous strategy. And then the intervention of Iran, and then finally the intervention of Russia, actually meant that the regime itself couldn't suppress the revolutionary upsurge. Instead, it relied on outside forces to do it, and in so doing, demolished huge areas of the country. And you see the footage coming out now, people returning to their home. Absolutely. I mean, I was having a discussion with a comrade in side of Palestine, and we were talking about the absolute destruction from Rafah all the way to Aleppo. Different forces involved in it, but demolition of the Gaza Strip, demolition of South Lebanon, of the Bekaa Valley, and then you go into Syria, demolition of large working class areas of Damascus, of Homs, of eastern Aleppo, all these kind of really traditional, big, important cities, completely devoid of population, driven out of the country, and so on. So you had, if you like, that dynamic taking place. However, the victory of the counter-revolution that takes place between sort of 2015, 2016, up until the point at which the regime collapses, was really a kingdom of rubble. The regime itself had lost any kind of sense of a popular base. Large parts of the country had left. What remained of the Islamist forces began to rally with the support of Turkey to a certain extent, Qatar and various others in the area around Idlib in the north along the border. And when the regime itself becomes very hollowed out, has now very little popular base. It becomes essentially a militia regime involved simply in drug running and extortion, all that kind of stuff. It loses any kind of foundations for any real foundations for it. So when it comes then to December of this year, Hayat Tahrir Sham, Islamist formation, well, the final, last surviving elements of the original revolution, and to a certain extent, part of the counter-revolution as well, which we can discuss as well, makes a push to re-enter Aleppo. There is one battle that takes place in which they overcome mainly Hezbollah troops as well as some Iranian troops. The Syrian army simply melts away. They march into eastern Aleppo, which they had to retreat from about 5 or 6 years ago, and then march into West Aleppo almost within hours, and then everything just collapsed very quickly. So you can see the route they took down what is called the main motorway. They went to Hama, and we thought, oh, there'd be a big battle in Hama, but there was no battle in Hama. Then there was no battle in Homs, and then before you know it, they were in Damascus. So there's that sense in which they were able to push a regime that was already hollow and already crumbling. So there's that element of it, and this is the one a lot of people concentrate on. But inside these events, there were some significant differences that will help, I think, shape the future struggle inside of Syria. The first of all is what happened inside of Sweda, which is the very south of the country. Sweda is very important for some Arab nationalist history. Sweda was the place the first uprising against the French began in 1925, 1926. It's also the place where the Syrian revolution begins in earnest in 2011, 2012. And instead, the regime doesn't destroy Sweda. Instead, what happens is the revolutionary forces, the armed forces that emerge out of the original revolution, are neutralized and brought into, if you like, under the banner of the regime in order to kind of neutralize them. And the first kind of massive break that takes place is the Syrian troops in the south simply defect. They defect from the regime over to the revolution as a unit, understand? So that they went as troops. They didn't melt away like the troops in Aleppo and so on. They stayed in their formations and simply moved over, changed their loyalty, went mutinied, if you like, and came over to the revolution. And then there's the absolute heartlands of the regime. This is along the most important being the city of Latakia, the big port city, and so on. And here there was an uprising. An uprising does take place in Latakia. Where does it begin? It begins in the Palestinian camps. I remember when the first footage came out, everyone was going, oh no, the Palestinians are going to get massacred again inside of. And so you saw the demonstrations going through the streets. And this was, if you like, a proper revolutionary upsurge that takes place. And even before Hayat Tahrir troops arrive at Damascus, the regime has collapsed, and a mass popular outpouring of people. They come into the streets, but it wasn't the same as in Latakia. It was simply people filling the vacuum, if you like. The troops are already gone, people filling the vacuum coming out to the streets. Whereas Latakia, there was a political fight as well as in Sweden. So you have different elements taking place, different dynamics taking place in different parts of the in different parts of the country. But what's interesting is the way in which if you like, the revolutionary threads have been picked up and are beginning to get tied together again. So we begin to see the reemergence of the local coordinating committees uh, from the original revolution, reformed, if you like, but also the way in which mass demonstrations become really important, mass gatherings of people have become really important. They welcomed in, obviously, the troops, the Islamist troops, uh, but but what was fascinating about it was you saw, essentially Damascene, young women, no hijab, hair out, taking their pictures next to the bearded Islamist fighter. So there was a sense you begin to see, if you like, the different forces at play already in the country. So there's two kind of sort of dynamics taking place here. We have the regime collapses, the last people left standing, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, come marching in. They, take the presidential palace, begin to reorganize the army and all that kind of stuff, take over the control of the state, if you like. But at the same time, then you have this upsurge that is taking place now, reorganization on the ground that's taking place with the development of new trade unions, the launching of the teachers' union, for example, the doctors' union, and so on, happening at extraordinary speed. And this is what we're seeing now, especially in Damascus. Now, there's problems in other parts of the country, but Damascus being quite key here, and the same in the south, that kind of reemergence of the revolutionary formations from 2011, 2012. That means actually now what we're beginning to see is the battle that's taking place inside the revolution that are re-emerging that took place inside the revolution earlier on. So you have the 2011, 2012 sort of uprising. The Islamists then dominate. They begin to dominate. How do they begin to dominate? By crushing everyone else. So they begin to, destroy elements of the independent movement. They begin to take apart local coordinating committees. It now becomes an Islamist revolution rather than a popular revolution. And inside of that, large numbers of revolutionaries, of leftists, lost their lives, not at the hands of the regime, but at the hands of the Islamists. So you have that struggle that taking place now projected onto a national scale. So when we talk about the battle of the future of the revolution, or a revolution of sorts, if you like, we have to talk about this. What is going to be the balance of forces between the Islamists taking over the structure of the state, beginning to rebuild it with the old elements of the old regime, and this popular movement coming from below. And we see now the way in which you have meetings after meetings taking place, discussions about the nature of the future of the Syria, and so on. At the same time, you see quite an extraordinary, what I would describe as the Hezbollahization of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I'll try and explain what that is. So if you are as old as me, I think some of you, I think you're all much younger anyway, but there's probably a few of you who will also remember this, was that when Hezbollah first appears in Lebanon after the fall of the PLO, it is an extraordinarily conservative and extraordinarily Islamist, I mean, strictly Islamist organization. It originally called itself Islamic Amal. They expected all the women inside the working class neighborhoods of South Beirut in the south to begin to look like, to wear the big heavy chador that they wear in Iran and so on, and very strict kind of Sharia kind of stuff. But they had to very quickly adapt themselves to the realities of social relations inside of Lebanon, which was actually not tribal. Actually, it was urban. Actually, it was, there was working class organizations, and Hezbollah begins to then drop that element of the more extreme history it has and become more and more secular in its outlook, to the extent that, for example, the example I always put, it became very involved in the sexual health campaigns, including use of condoms, talking to the gay community, trying to suppress AIDS and so on. Actually, when they needed to, if you like, deal with the realities of being the dominant power in various areas, then they had to take on the social conditions itself. One of the things they also had to do was to address the issues, the economic issues, and so on. So they couldn't do this inside of a very strict Islamist agenda. They had to secularize, if you like, even though not necessarily in language or belief, but secularize in terms of how they how they organize. So you see this now with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham having to deal with the fact that they have to deal with Christians, they have to deal with Druze, they have to deal with Shia al-Alawi and various others, because Syria is very much a mosaic like that. The largest religious group is the Sunnah, the Sunni, but there are, historically, it's very important um, for people in the area that that you become, if you like, the custodian of this history of rich cultural tradition. So you see, almost immediately the beards get shorter. They start talking. The first woman governor in Syrian history happens under the Islamists in the south. The director of the bank of the top economic director of the Bank of Syria is a woman. So they begin to have to go through that process, if you like, of having to adapt to the realities of Syrian society, Syrian social rules, away from very strict Islamists. And you see this also with the way in which Hayat have appointed, for example, the Minister of Justice. They appointed the Minister of Justice, and then very quickly it emerges that back 10 years ago, he oversaw the execution of a woman for adultery and yeah, uh, uh, sexual crimes. And I'm not exactly sure what it is, and how the pressure now on them to dump this guy, that he's not acceptable, if you like, Syria. So you begin to see the way in which this takes place. At the same time, you also begin to very quickly see the limits of Islamist politics, and going from a quite kind of radical a radical program of Islamization and anti-imperialism and so on, very quickly then have to start making deals. First, they made a deal with Turkey. That was quickly. Now the Bahraini ambassadors arrive. They're going to Saudi Arabia. They're, welcoming the Germans and the European Union, even though that turned out to be a damn squib for Syria, attempting to then project this image of being kind of neutral in the Arab-Israeli conflict. At the same time as they're beginning to take control, the Israelis are, marching over large important strategic areas of Syria. Strategic not simply militarily, but strategic in terms of water supplies, the dams, the rivers, and so on, which the Israelis see as crucial to the long-term survival of their state. And so at the same time as you have this kind of massive Israeli encroachment, you're having Hayat, the Islamists being very, very softly and stepping back and not wanting to ruffle any feathers or upset any potential investors. And you can see the way in which the struggle inside of Syria is going to take sort of various forms. One is this struggle over economic, what's the economic future of the country? Is it going to be simply Gulf capital coming in, Turkish, construction companies coming in, and all this kind of stuff? Or is it going to be something much more broadly social that people talk about? Actually, we need to rebuild some form of welfare state. Actually, there's elements of the old Syria we want to keep. The secular education, for example, that's been another battle. So all these things have taken place, but they're taking place inside of an atmosphere of very, how should I put it, extreme positivity, if you want to use that kind of American term, that in which there's all kinds of forces beginning to emerge. And we don't know where these forces are going yet, but they're beginning to shape themselves. And it's not going to be simply an easy ride of Hayat simply coming in, taking over, and that's the end of that. But actually, there's going to be a whole series of battles opening up, and we can really see that we can really see that now. Now, in terms of what this kind of means, this strategy and the problem with this strategy that Hayat have adopted for Syria is that the West isn't playing ball. And we always said the sanctions on Syria were not about the Assad regime. The sanctions on Syria was about keeping quite an important country with huge population and massive potential resources weak in order for Western imperialism to dominate. So Assad falls. The new Syrian government turns and says, you need to remove the sanctions. The Germans arrive, and that horrible minister from the Green Party, the foreign minister from the Green Party, and says, oh, no, you don't. We keep sanctions on you. The Americans give them a 6 month free ride on a few elements of sanctions relief, but actually the sanctions are going to stay as well. The sanctions will remain, and being nice to the West isn't going to remove that. So this is, I think, the first thing that's beginning to emerge is the realization that the Western sanctions on Syria were not sanctions on the regime, but the sanctions on the country. We got rid of the regime, the sanctions have remained. So this is a battle that is going to be taking place. And of course, the other one is the question of Israel and what the Israelis are doing. And it's interesting that the first Syrian to fall uh, uh, um, since the collapse of the regime was from the south in Quneitra, which is now occupied by the Israelis. A demonstration of locals trying to stop the Israelis coming to the town. They opened fire on them. So we have now the first martyr, if you like, after the fall of the old order, and this martyr fell attempting to defend their town against Israeli encroachment. So this now begins to have the dynamic that it needs. I think Hayat expected the Americans to come and go, "Thank you very much. We'll simply, wind the Israelis back to the 1967, 1973 borders." But actually, the Israelis are not playing ball, and Hayat are now, the Syrian forces in Syria that are Muslim forces now understand that there has to be this battle against the Israelis. You can't duck it. They can't duck it because of the very nature of the Israeli regime itself, which is expansionist, constantly need to expand, and especially the mob in charge of Israel now, very much driving this idea of a greater Israel. Grab as much as you can, South Lebanon, Gaza Strip. They're going to annex the West Bank, and so on. So this means that whatever good intentions they have to try and be as nice as they can in order to have these sanctions lifted and be welcomed back into the international community. This is actually the Israeli element of it isn't going to allow that, and so that's an important that's an important part of that. So inside of that is this struggle. I just want to I know I'm going on a little bit, but I just want to very finish on this point, which has to do with Lebanon, which is we have seen the defeat of Hezbollah. I think we can now accept that, not the crushing, not the destruction, but very much a defeat of Hezbollah. To see the south now is absolutely heartbreaking. They have demolished most of the south in a way they never did before. It's going to be really hard for people to go back, and so the Battle of the South is now beginning again. At the same time, there is this legacy of Hezbollah getting involved in the counter-revolution in Syria that now compromises massively their position inside of the resistance and the goodwill, I think, of the Syrian people. That's another major problem. At the same time, there was an attempt by the Israelis to trigger a sectarian backlash against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It was a very forceful attempt, supported by Western powers, obviously, but also by elements inside of Lebanese society as well. And this was resisted not by Hezbollah, but by the popular movement that has been around now for nearly 20 years inside of Lebanon. It is this relationship between the mass movements and the resistance that we keep coming back to in Lebanon. I think they're going to start having to come to inside of Syria. The relationship in which Hezbollah is not seen as the resistance, but as one form of the resistance that has taken place over this period. Before then was the PLO and the Communist Party, and so then before them was the Arab Nationalists, and so on. Before them, the 1930s and so on, with the Islamists and the princes, and so. So it's seen as another stage, if you like, inside of this. That failure to divide the Lebanese and have them turn against the resistance means that the victory of Israel over Hezbollah is to a certain extent blunted, because there is still this this understanding that there needs to be resistance, this understanding that we're going to lose the south if we don't resist, and Hezbollah have to be the people there, so we will support them. But if they fail to do it, then some other force will come in. This is very much the feeling I'm getting from Lebanon, and there is a sense in which we have no choice on this matter because Israel is an expansion state. So all these things are taking place. So we have, if you like, defeats taking place and rearrangements taking place geopolitically and in big imperial powers. But at the same time, we have this emergence, if you like, emergence of the popular movement again in Syria, and the the fact that the Lebanese masses on a whole were able to hold the unity under extreme pressure. So it actually means that popular movements in both countries are going to be very important to shape the future struggles. Thank you very much, comrades, for allowing me to talk this long.
So I think that was very, very, very clear. A intro, and I think the idea of the secularization of HTS having its limits, I think is a very interesting one. And I think you outlined the role of Israel as an expansionist state as being something that has to be confronted. If people want to make a contribution, just put your hand up, and maybe we could have a chat about that. And Simon, at the end, maybe you want to come back in and address some of those questions. So, yeah, Marnie, your hand is up. Des, yeah, Marnie, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that. I must say it's so refreshing to hear the positivity, actually, and the talk of struggle and so on that you really highlight, because so much of the the left, people like Tariq Ali and so on, announced the fall of Assad as a defeat. And here in Ireland, we encounter still, small amounts of people, but defense of the Assad regime, which is quite pathetic. And your talk really puts it in a whole different dimension of the possibility of struggle and so on. And that's really great. I just have a couple of thoughts and questions. Is first of all, the difference between, as you pointed out, between Egypt and Syria from the point of view of the revolution, that the Egyptian revolution was more deep-seated, more working class based, more self-activity, if you like, in the workplaces and so on. But also the difference now that, and I'd like you to see if I'm right, you think I agree with this, but the fragility, in a sense, of the Assad regime meant that the military disappeared completely, has disappeared, whereas in Egypt, the compromises that the Muslim Brotherhood made with the military allowed the military regime to come back. So it is a different dynamic in Syria. And rather than seeing that automatically the same thing is going to happen in Syria, that is one dimension. And I'd like to know your opinion about that. Secondly, HTS. I mean, you described it as